Hello everyone, I am Jonathan, also known as the PC Genie, and today we're going to talk about, as per the title, my top 5 overrated zombie apocalypse weapons. Now, these aren't to say that all of these weapons are necessarily useless, or to say that they don't have their purpose, but it's just that it seems that they're sort of portrayed as better than they really are, and that really, even though we're talking about a fairly out there and fairly fictional, depending on your interpretation, topic, we still need to at least try to ground things in reality. So let's get to our first weapon. Our first weapon that is quite overrated is this. Now this is, in this particular one, it's a pipe wrench and a small one, but I'm going to include all wrenches, spanners, even carpentry hammers and things like that, all under this category of your sort of smallish, blunt, sort of improvised weapons. Because they have basically all the things I'm going to say now that these seem quite targeted against this pipe wrench, really just broadly apply to all of these. So obviously, this is much better than nothing. I mean, compared to doing things like using your fists or grabbing a plate to smack a zombie with, this is significantly better. It stays in a hand, it's got this nice handle so it doesn't want to sort of fly out or do anything uncomfortable when I'm trying to swing it around. It's got weighting towards the head, so it's got that impact. It's not like I'm having a useless sort of hit, so it's better than maybe, for example, a small torch or something. You know, I've got one that I had at work, which is about this big, barely fits outside the palm of the hand. Now I could try to go, kind of hit them with that. So this is significantly better, but in the grand scheme of things, of all the various weapons you could use, it falls very low on the list. And in the case of the smaller ones like this, it's your reach. I mean, I say in terms of the actual impact and the force and the trauma, it's much better than using a fist. But in terms of your typical advantages, being able to maneuver around, catch, actually cause, sort of stave your opponent by hitting them at range, all of those kinds of advantages you can have that make weapons much better than your fists, or, grappling and wrestling of a zombie, this is hardly any better at all. I mean, as you can see, here's how far my punch it reaches, and here's how far the wrench reaches. It's hardly any further at all. But of course, if you look at the larger versions, because of the way these are designed, I don't know if it's the weight gives it better leverage when, wrenching things, or why they're designed like that. Maybe it's durability. That aside, what I do know is that once you've gotten to reasonable reach, the larger sort of hefty pipe wrenches, you end up with them being so heavy you can't wield them properly. And I mean, sure, you could assume that zombies is going to be kind of sluggish and kind of go, very unenthusiastically towards you. Any day will do. But that seems like a very dangerous assumption. And what about other people, who, brigands and people who want to assail you? All those scenarios. It's just such a danger to have a heavy weapon that you can barely swing. You basically have to commit to your first swing and hope for the best, or otherwise you're basically dead. Or you end up with a smaller version like this, and you have to constantly be in danger by getting close to whatever you want to hit. So overall, they're not very good at all. At number 4, we have got the Crowbar. Now yes, I just said that I'd be looking at weapons that are fairly similar and sort of small impact weapons, but it seems like the Crowbar, most especially, seems to get quite a bit of attention. So I'm going to dedicate a whole section to this one. It'll be a quick one though. Now, with crowbars, apart from the fact that, like I mentioned, you can get larger and smaller versions which either are a bit short or actually don't really, they're either too short and don't reach, or they're not the best weighted and they can end up being very heavy swingers that aren't very useful in combat. But also, in terms of, yes, they're a useful tool, so if I wanted to pry a door open or open up a box or those sorts of things, the crowbar is great. But it is still quite a heavy item. It sits quite heavy when you're carrying it around, considering the fact that, unlike on TV, you don't just go to the next scene and, aha, now it's time for the fight. You've got to spend those hours or even just minutes still, walking around and going between places or driving in a car between places, and you've got to carry these things around. Terrible idea. And I mean, the way they strike as well, I mean, with things like hammers or the pipe wrench mentioned earlier, you've got a head so you can hit forwards and it strikes. Whereas with this, because the crowbar is always designed at that sort of angle, you can't just strike forwards and hit, because you end up hitting at this sort of angle and it sort of slides off. It's actually quite bad for hitting things. You almost have to sort of treat it like it's some sort of slicing weapon and sort of drag along. Now, it is better in some ways in the fact that it can hook. You can do various things, maybe around the legs. You could, for example, hook around the legs, push up at the chin, risking a bite, pull up while pushing forwards, so you can have that sort of leverage. Basically something that is taught in Fiore de la Berry's unarmed manuscripts, where you can face an opponent who is trying to grab you, push up at their chin, grab whichever leg is forward and pull up. You could instead reach a bit further for the same leverage and pull up with a crowbar or similar hooked item instead. But apart from that, it isn't really much better than the pipe wrenches and things we mentioned earlier. There is a sort of a back spike which could be used to thrust. That's a good thing, but again, I mean, I either end up with something quite heavy and trying to reach it out like this will be tiring, very tiring, or I'm choking up and I'm using a much closer range, in which case it's not very good. I mean, I've got barely any extra range. It's not a proper spike, it's just, you know, a part of a crowbar. I could use a knife or a spear instead. So that's what I should do. At number 3, we have axes. Now I'm going to include all versions of axes here. In fact, I'll also include hatchets, I'll also mention. So with these, of course, they're very often seen in movies, television, and video games, especially with fire axes. You've got these epic brain destroyers, the perfect anti-zombie weapon where you can just swing around and yes, you've got them. But in reality, they're very unwieldy. You see, historically, axes, large axes were used as weapons, but there are a few key differences to what we normally see. Firstly, you've got versions which are typically lighter, so unlike, say, a felling axe, this here is a felling axe and it is a 4-pound head. You would see something that maybe is a couple of pounds or something like that, or maybe 3 pounds. Or if it was something like 4 pounds, you'd see it in a version like a bardiche. And a bardiche basically has the part sort of curving forwards. It's almost like a moon shape. I'll have a picture, just pop it here. So as you can see, you've got a point at the top so it can thrust. You have got a large cutting surface, so you don't need to be quite as accurate up or down the shaft. And it also means that it's got a bit more of a sort of a cleaver-like blade, rather than this axe, which is a wedge. Yes, it's sharp, but it is more of a dull sort of wedge shape. Something like a bardiche or battle axe or something like that actually has a thinner and more, more finely honed blade. And it's designed, obviously, it wouldn't be as good at cutting down trees or destroying furniture, but in man-to-man combat, it's going to be very effective. And frankly, I mean, I struggle to, even when I'm actually searching online to purchase such axes like a bardiche or a battle axe, you very rarely see them. But yet, very commonly, the sorts of large axes people have got access to are the ones that I really don't recommend, like this. But secondly, there's the fact that axes on the battlefield were typically used with other people. So you'd have maybe someone who has a large axe, along with people who've got spears, people who've got swords, bows, all sorts of things. You've got people who are very specialist, they would be very strong, they'd be trained to know to keep the momentum of an axe going, so you don't stop, you don't give an opening, because if I swing and open myself to recover for another swing, that's a time when a zombie could grab and bite me, someone could stab me, all kinds of things. So what you actually have to do with an axe is constantly keep momentum going, all the time, and as you can see I'm not perfect at it, but I've got some rough idea, but I'm still, you know, even after practicing quite a bit, I'm still pretty crap at it. So you can see all of these moments. Even looking at the video now, you might have seen some opportunities. You could have just bloody charged in and thrown me to the ground if you're big enough or know enough martial arts. And this is a problem, because I'm not really much better off with this sort of axe. And it's so heavy. Carrying this around would be very ungainly, much worse than the things we mentioned before. So overall, not recommended. If you want something better, I'd recommend something like this. I mean, pole-arms in general, but this is a billhook. It's lighter, it's got a broader cutting edge. If I could be bothered to do so, I'd actually cut parts off and turn it into a sort of spear, so I could thrust of it as well. It's much more agile, it's got better reach, I can do all kinds of things with it. It's got all what I need in a weapon, but it's big, so it's not, you know, I can't exactly store it in my pocket, can I? But, you know, definitely better than a felling axe. And at number 2, we have got knives. Now, yes, overall, actually, I do very strongly recommend keeping knives around. You can just store them, you know, you have them in their slots, their sheaths and scabbards in the pocket. You know, you can conceal them, someone might not know, and then, haha, don't mess with me, all of that sort of stuff. But as a primary weapon, and this is something I've seen a lot as well in zombie movies, television, video games, it's recommended actively as a primary weapon. And I'd very much say that's a bad idea. Just like before the pipe wrenches, I've got very little reach. And yes, I can stab, and in some cases I can cut and do all sorts of things. If I've got something larger and heavier, like a bowie knife, I could, you know, really kind of cut into a head, perhaps. But it's very dangerous. You have to play the grappling game, sacrifice a hand you could use for grabbing to wield a knife. So I'm basically trying to stave a zombie away with my hand, which is why I definitely want some sort of armour, because high chance of getting bitten or scratched. And I'd be trying to sort of manipulate them, you know, go and do all sorts of, I'm not even sure what, I'll probably maybe some sort of lock going under the armpit, rising up into this sort of boar's tooth, as it's called in Fury stuff. You grab the other hand and then put them to the ground, stab or something. It would be really difficult. Because, you know, again, every time you're doing something like pushing up at the chin or going into the armpits, you're ending up in a range where teeth can get sunk into you. I don't like that. So this is a great item that everyone, even if you're a pacifist and don't want to kill anything or anyone, it's a great item to have around, a knife, and it makes me so a bit confused that there's so much control on knives, but, I mean, criminals keep using them as weapons, so I suppose it makes sense that there's a lot of law against them. But knives, in terms of their tool purposes and combat purposes, are great in terms of this is a great backup weapon. If I've dropped something, if I can't carry a decent weapon, I can use it as a last resort. But the whole point of it being so overrated is the fact that it's treated as a primary weapon, as in, this is my first resort, when really, same as with the pipe wrenches, I put it quite low down on the weapon list, and it's more of a last resort before grappling and using your fists and whatnot. So if you've got anything that you can use instead of a knife that's better, such as spears, swords, baseball bats, you know, all kinds of things that are available to you. I've got polearms, machetes and things. You know, use those instead, and use the knife if you can't use those weapons instead. That's the key difference here, and why these are so grossly overrated. Last, but certainly not least, we have the machete. Now, actually, amongst the weapons, normally I've said, oh, well, here's the ranged weapons, and most of them are down at this end, poor choices, but for once, this is one that I've got quite high up on the list. So I know you'd be wondering, why am I saying it's so overrated then? Simple, because it's treated as this be-all, end-all, ultimate. I've even seen it referred on certain, you know, places that's treated as the ultimate, the best zombie-killing weapon, when really, it's not. I mean, you've got a scale of tools. Now, amongst tools, items not directly intended for warfare, it is, I'd say, the best amongst them. So if we have a scale here of what's good for weapons again, and tools go up to about here, the Machete I'd put about here. It really is the best of them. But obviously, all we have to do is look at any proper weapon, and it's good. You know, it's better than this. So we've got various examples of things like swords, because this is the closest thing you can get to a sword without being a sword. So that's an obvious example. Swords can thrust. They've got double edges. I've put a double edge on this one, but it didn't come with it. You've got double edges, you can thrust. You've got quillons, so you can catch and manipulate certain limbs. You can manipulate weapons that are coming towards you, so you're not just parry on the edge and then go from there. Actually, parry on the edge, I can control and do all sorts of things. You've got the pommel, which can allow more weight in the weapon for a bit more heft, and usually a bit better size, without having to sacrifice it being ungainly. So that's better. And also just the fact that usually they're more designed for fighting. This specific one is the Cold Steel 24-inch Latin machete, and it's a very good example of a machete. It's a very good weapon example of a machete, that is. But I mean, I've already reviewed this, and you know, I've talked about its advantages and disadvantages and whatnot. But your typical machete does not look like this. This has got a good reach. It's got a fairly narrow edge. It's got a very narrow blade, so it takes a finer edge. So it's very good. It's well weighted. It's fantastic as a weapon and also as a gardening tool. But your typical machete looks a bit more like this. Now this is just one I bought for £5 from a military surplus store, but it's much worse in the fact that, I mean, again, it only had one edge. I put this back edge on myself, so it's only single edged, so you can't do any back cuts with machetes. Swords can. Apart from that, it's got a very short reach. I mean, my knife reaches about a third to a half way along this. Oh, yeah, more like a third of the way along. Let me have a look. Nearly half. Anyway, so it's not much better in terms of reach than the knife. A lot of them are much thicker, especially if you look at your traditional ones. This is a sort of modern manufacturer one, which is lighter and thinner because that's cheaper to make. Whereas your thicker, stockier ones have the problems of axes, where, yeah, they've got sharp edges, but they're designed to be durable, and they're designed to have more sort of broad wedge-shaped edges, which are not very good if you want to do fine slicing and chopping. You really have to put more muscle into a hack, which, in a realistic fighting scenario, you're not going to be there going, hang on, let me prepare, okay, legs here, okay, I've got this, let's gauge the range, yeah, just like test cutting, okay, and there we go. No, you're going to be there doing your quick cuts, you're going to be moving around trying to do what you can, you don't want that guy to get close to you, all sorts of things. So most of your cuts probably won't be the best that you can deliver, but with a machete that's not got a good edge, you might need the best you can deliver to actually deal the proper damage. So that's a serious problem. Whereas, really, if you look at things like swords or spears, other pole arms, if you look at things like, even one of my favourites, having a rifle with a bayonet on the end, you can do things like choke up if you need to get in close, as in we're almost at grappling range, whereas you can't really do anything of this. It's not got a stabbing point. You'd be just uselessly butting against people. Pointless. You'd have to switch to your knife again. Whereas you can also do things like lunging, you can shoot with it, all sorts. This, it can cut, which Doug Markaida might like. It can kill. But, sorry, but I mean, apart from that, it's not really the best. It's good, but it's not the best. And why go for something that's mediocre when you can go for something that's really good? That's what I always wonder. So, yeah, the machete's quite overrated, especially your typical versions. So that's that for today. And tell me if you want to hear more about weapons and armour and all sorts of things. Feel free to subscribe if you want that sort of stuff. And I shall see you in the next video. Ta-ra!